Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Boring to Badass, where we're helping B2B marketers like yourselves learn how to take traditionally boring brands into badass brands. And so we all know clear communication is important, but for many of us, including myself, we're often ineffective communicators. For me, I tend to overcomplicate things. So, how can we improve our communication skills and leverage that both internally and externally within our organization? And so I don't have the answer to that question. Our guest, Joseph McGuire, does. He's a facial analysis expert and has been helping decode the language of communication for over 40 years, whether it's navigating negotiations, sealing deals, conducting interviews, or leading teams. He's done it all, which is why I'm super excited to have Joseph on the show today and help you learn how to improve your communication skills. So thanks for coming on the show, Joseph.
Oh, thank you for having me, Justin. Delighted to be here.
Awesome. Cool. So let's start with a really fundamental question. What is communication in general? And like kind of what are the elements that make up communication?
Well, many people think communication is speaking. Speaking is one element, but it's only one element. And particularly in the business context, there are several key components. There's intention, there's preparation, there's presence, which is one people often forget about, because our very presence, whether we're online, whether we're meeting in person, our very presence communicates so much about who we are, how we are, and whether we're likely to be perceived as being trustworthy, believable, etc. And then we come to listening and observation, which again, many people get both of those wrong or miss out to a large degree on both. And then we come to speaking. Now, all of them work together, but if any of those components are missing, or if the effective use of any of those components are missing, then there's a hole in our communication.
Cool. And so you had said you hit on one of the things I was thinking is like the effectiveness of communication. So what are some differences between what is effective communication versus like ineffective communication?
Yeah, there's a lot of what happens in apparent communication is people talking at each other. The fact that you might be an expert at what you do and you may understand it to the finest degree does not mean the person or the audience you're speaking to understands it in anything like the same way. So we need to understand who our audience is, how they receive and process information. And if we're not clear about that, like one of the things I tend to mention in my presentations, in background crowd scenes in movies and in TV shows, I don't know if it's still the case, but it used to be the case that the crowds were taught to use the word rhubarb. So everybody would be saying rhubarb, 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 and it sounds like a conversation, but the sounds are not distinctive enough to distract from what the main actors are saying. So if you are not clear about how your audience processes information, receives and processes information, what they could be hearing is effectively rhubarb, rhubarb, rhubarb.
That's cool. I never knew that. That's really interesting. So how do you how would we know, or are there ways that we can kind of detect, especially when we're communicating in real time, that our messaging and communication is being interpreted the way we intend it to?
Yeah, one thing that people often neglect doing is checking. Like if I make a point to you, I will ask, is there anything else you need to know? Or have I left anything out? And they're very simple questions, but if we don't ask them, we can assume that people have understood as we've intended them to, but they may have taken an entirely different interpretation. So give the information, give the evidence, as it were, and then check whether people have got it or not. It's really very simple.
Yeah. Yeah, making it an actual conversation, right? And not just a one-way
Yeah.
discussion. So
Yeah, and that applies in an interview situation. It applies in a negotiation. It applies in sales. It applies two people, it applies. Colleagues are working together in an office. We tend to assume so much, and particularly if we are like the expert or the purported expert in whatever it is we do.
Yeah. Do you have some examples of, because I know you've worked with tons of companies over the years, do you have some examples of like where, you know, making that improvement in the communication made an impact in the business?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the challenges is getting the leaders to recognize that they are part of the problem, because ego tends to play a big role in the lives of many leaders. They've climbed the ladder, etc., and they see themselves as being elevated, and that can be a problem in itself. So one of the problems that tends to come to my attention, it's one of the reasons I tend to be brought in, is I'll hear the staff are not responding. They're not paying attention. And obviously in the last few years, we've come across, quiet quitting, the great resignation, presenteeism, where people are present in body, or they're just not performing. We know they're well capable, but for whatever reason, they're not performing. And a lot of that boils down to communication. So I would typically be brought in, and it's a non-negotiable thing for me to speak with the leaders first, to identify what it is they're communicating, how they're communicating, what's their intention behind the communication, and then what kind of responses or non-responses are they getting. So typically then I will find gaps in how the leaders are presenting the information, presenting their instructions. And once we get that clear, and once we get clear then about who the audience is, what's been lacking, and how they maybe initially responded with enthusiasm and with a higher level of performance, then we can develop a communication style, a communication process, and that's obviously a general scenario, but that's just been repeated so often across the board, and it's irrelevant to the industry, because I've worked with businesses in so many different industries. But it's typically that the leaders are not communicating clearly, and not just in terms of the words, but sometimes the tone of voice as well. And that can be in the memos, the emails. It can be in how they speak. That there can be, whether it's intended or otherwise, there can be a perception of them being arrogant, patronizing, or even dismissive. And certainly, like if you look at like report after report from like Great Place to Work, PwC, McKinsey, Edelman Trust Report, trust and respect are key issues being cited by so many employees across so many different industries, that they feel that it's being reported that they feel a lack of trust, a lack of respect from their leaders. And if the leaders do not know how to convey trust and respect, the company is going to pay a price, a serious price.
Very cool. So a couple of things I wanted to dive into on some of that. So one of the first ones was you had mentioned, you know, the tone of voice and sometimes being perceived as like arrogant or not caring. Obviously, how you communicate, that's important, but is it also a mindset shift for a lot of these executives that they almost have to like change how they view stuff? Is that typically part of that process?
Absolutely, and that's where I have to acknowledge that they have achieved success. They have risen, they've climbed the ladder because of their capability. I have to acknowledge that to them and be very open about that and be respectful towards them. Well, I have to then talk with them about, okay, what's your intention here? What are the results you're looking for? How do you wish to be perceived? And they all wish to be perceived as successful. and they want to be perceived as great communicators. What are the results you're looking for? And you can present it to them depending on the personality. You can present it to them in terms of tactics and strategy, but the more genuinely authentic they are in demonstrating respect for their employees, for their workforce, the better the results tend to be in terms of performance, in terms of people really showing up, in terms of the team cohesion, in terms of customer satisfaction. Because one of the things that also tends to happen if the communication is poor and morale drops is you get customer dissatisfaction rising, and you get customers clients disappearing, moving on. So you're seeing very practical, tangible results if you get your communication right.
And it sounds like, so at least some of the words I kind of am like thinking of is, um, humility, empathy, like some of those, like if you realize that you're not being very empathetic, and if you can't be, you know, if you can't have humility, then it seems like that can be a really big barrier to being an effective communicator.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And one of the, at least in my eyes, one of the mistakes people make is they think of those things as being soft skills. I refer to human skills. And again, it's about what are the results you're looking for. Because if you're in business, you want results. And if you have genuine empathy, and I mean genuine empathy, then people respond to you. It really is very simple. And I'm not talking about necessarily even liking people. I'm talking about just communicating in a way that shows, look, I value what you're doing here. I may not like you, but I value how you're going about your job, how you're performing, and I respect it. And you get the rewards for that. So good job, well done. Employee of the month, whatever the acknowledgement may be. But when you show that genuine acknowledgement, and people feel, and that's the thing so many executives don't get. We are actually governed by feeling more than by logic. So if people feel respected, if they feel heard, they will contribute so much more.
What would be some of the first steps? Say someone wants to improve their communication skills. What are some of the first things that they should be focusing on to improve those skills?
Yeah. One of the things is presence. One of the key things is presence. So how do you show up? And if I'm working with somebody, I will, ideally I will meet them in person, but even if we're meeting online, we will record the video in terms of the conversations we have. So we will then dissect the video in terms of their presence, their presentation, how they've communicated verbally and non-verbally. So are you presenting with confidence? Are you presenting as being interested in the person you're speaking with, genuinely interested? And are you curious about them? That demonstrates that you are interested. Because so often what happens is people talk out of where they're coming from with no intent to really listen. And if you really listen, you'll find you get to know what's really going on for the person. But you may also find, again, in purely practical business terms, you may also find they have ideas or they have information that could be invaluable to you if you're open to hearing it and drawing it out of them.
So I know one of the challenges I have sometimes is when you're talking with someone and you're like, oh, there's something I want to bring up or ask, and you keep it in your head. And then in that process of keeping it in your head, you're not listening to the conversation. Oh, are there ways that you like tips or things that you can do to try to, I guess, just get yourself out of that mindset to be fully engaged and focused on the conversation?
Practice. practice, practice, practice. It's I'm not sure if it was Gary Player or Lee Trevino, two of the legendary golfers of the past, whichever of them was described as being lucky. And he said, it's funny. The more I practice, the luckier I get. And it does involve practice. So you start with your daily conversations with, if you have a partner, if you have children, start there by listening, not talking not telling them, asking questions, and get into the habit of asking questions, and then asking more questions. Because when you get into that practice, people find you more interesting, as well as the fact that you're practicing, again, developing actually priceless communication skills. And when you really develop the art of listening and the willingness to listen, you start to hear differently, because you're hearing not just what people say, you're hearing how people say it. You're hearing changes in tone, changes in pitch, changes in rhythm. You're hearing gaps in what they say. And you're hearing, oh, they left something out there, whether it's intentional or otherwise. Mm-hmm. So there's so much beyond the words, but unless you're really listening, as opposed to listening to respond. Very and cool. one of the things I've found is, again, absolutely priceless. And I think I probably had it even as a child, is to be willing to be silent with people. If you're at peace with being silent with people, it's amazing how much they'll tell you. And it's so invaluable really in sales, in negotiation, but that real willingness to listen and just be. And when you become at ease with silence, you'll find a lot of people are not at ease with silence, and they tell you so much. Even people with a lot of experience, even people highly successful in business, will tell you so much that they hadn't necessarily either intended to tell you, or maybe they hadn't even thought of. So it's practice, 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 listening, asking questions, and then you come to hear in a very different way.
Awesome. Yeah, it's one of those things where I tend to have over time practiced more on, like, in a conversation, when someone stops, giving it another second and living kind of in that awkward silence, because like you said, sometimes that's when the real information gets conveyed sometimes. So
yeah, absolutely. And even like one of the books I tend to recommend a lot to people, and I know it's become so famous now. It's Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss, the former chief hostage negotiator with the FBI. And one of the things he does is it's mirror. He calls it mirroring, and we usually think in terms of mirroring as being body language. But what he does is, when people say something and there's something else there, you just repeat the last 2 or 3 words of what they've said, but the intonation is as if you're asking a question, but you're not actually asking a question. And then you shut up. And again, it draws so much out of people, and it's so simple. And even if you're with somebody, even if it's 2 people in the conversation who both know this skill, you can still do it to each other and still draw stuff out of people.
Yeah. Cool. So so moving kind of from some of the internal communication, because one of the things when we had our pre-show call that I thought was really interesting is we talked about then how you communicate and measure kind of the effectiveness of your communication externally. And I know you talked about kind of how brands tend to fail on some of that external communication. So what are some common issues that you typically see a lot of businesses doing when it comes to that external communication?
Yeah, one of the things that comes up time and again is when people use a visual image of somebody of a person, and they're looking to convey an emotion, whether it's desire, excitement, anticipation, and the expression on the model's face is completely blank, where there's no correlation between the visual and the wording or the intention. And you see that so often. So if you pay attention to that, you'll see it far more frequently than you should. I don't know why. I don't know why it's so ubiquitous, but it is, and that's probably the most common one.
Um, do you have any other common ones as well that you can think of offhand that you see over and over again as well?
I guess I tend to recognize the good ones
Oh, okay.
more
What are some good
more.
examples then?
Yeah, well, there's a few that have taglines that are just so on the button, like this Nike, just do it. And it conveys so much in 3 words, because it's the brand is about taking action. It's about being active, and it's just do it. It's so simple, so concise. There's the L'Oreal ad, because you're worth it. And that's actually quite a profound message to give to people.
Yeah.
And when you associate that with a brand, that really elevates the brand. Um, so they're a couple that really stand out for me.
Yeah, those are great examples. What are some things marketers can do to improve their external communication? I know we talked about obviously making sure the imagery matches the wording, but what are some other things like are there any ways that they can measure how successfully the communication is resonating with the intended audience? Like what are some things or research they can do to before they even start that process?
Yeah, well, there's obviously professional marketers are doing a lot of research anyway. So there are a lot of metrics in the marketplace, and I'm not coming quite from that space.
Mhm.
So I'm observing the results, but not from that statistical analysis perspective.
Mhm.
I'm looking at whether the presentation conveys the emotion,
Mhm. Yep.
connects that internal emotional response they're looking for from the audience. So one of the key things I would say, just as a general point, is to simplify, simplify, simplify. And one thing I'm seeing increasingly, and I can't name an ad off the top of my head, but one of the things I am seeing increasingly is, or the impression I'm getting is, that some marketers are looking to impress other marketers
Mm. Yep.
rather than connect with an audience. So that's something I would be, certainly if I were paying for market research and I were paying for advertising, it's something I would be seriously concerned with. I would probably be looking to renegotiate contracts there, or even in some cases end the contract.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. I know what you mean by marketers looking to impress other marketers. It's hard to like articulate that, but I know exactly what you're talking about. I've seen stuff like that where it seems to be trying to be catchy or witty, I guess, for the sake of being catchy and witty. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the work of, like, the names that most strongly come to mind would be Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and their work on how the mind works and how we absorb and process information. So much of what's going on is that we are guided by emotion first, and too many marketers seem to be working on this sort of higher logical plane and not taking into account the emotional dimension, because our decisions are so primarily based on emotion, And then, as we say, we justify them with logic.
Mm.
But I have heard, too many people say, "Oh, we'd like to take the logic, we'd like to take the emotion out of it," and that's one of the biggest mistakes you can make.
Yeah, cool. So, well, one last question then. Going into talking about the emotional and the fact that people lead with emotion before logic, when we interpret communication, what are like generally what's a typical thought process for someone? Obviously, they're thinking emotionally, but like what do you like? I guess what do people typically or notice first? Colors, like the imagery, like what's kind of that process? So like as marketers, we can think about when we're creating collateral to make sure that we're appealing to the emotional part first before we hit it with any logic.
Absolutely, absolutely. If we're including a human in the process,
Mm,
the first thing is a smile.
mm,
The first thing is to have that, particularly obviously we want to convey a positive emotion, and it should be what we call the full Duchenne smile, where the eyes are smiling as well.
mm,
And so often in photos, again, whether it's advertising or you're looking at politicians, celebrities, etc., you'll see the false social smile, where the eyes are not engaged, and that conveys a message that no, I don't really buy it. So if the eyes are not smiling, it's not authentic, it's not convincing. And then you get into the colors and what's the impact of different colors. And again, that there's a cultural dimension to that.
mm.
Like,
Yeah.
for example, um, we would regard red in we in Westerners generally would regard
Mm,
red as as a power color, and we would regard white as a very very passive, very peaceful,
mm,
almost meditative, reflective color. But if you go to China, certainly you'll see red a lot, but you won't see white,
mm.
because white is associated with death.
Mm.
So if you're
Interesting.
like, so it depends on where you're looking to do your advertising as well. Blue tends to be universally accepted. It tends to be probably the least controversial color in terms of cultures across the board.
Mm,
But it depends on what it is you're looking to convey. In the West, if you're talking about power, red. If you're talking about communication, trustworthiness, blue. Communication, blue. If you're talking about a more sort of light, jazzy kind of up tempo, yellows and orange. But it depends on the context, and what shade of yellow, orange, blue, how much of it. So and that's the stuff that the marketers will have. They'll have the statistics on that,
yeah.
down to a T. But the cultural dimension is so important. But if you're bringing in the human element, the smile, the smile
Mm.
actually, the smile is a selling point.
Very cool. Yeah, I've known about some of the cultural color things. I didn't know about the human element of that and the smile and all that. So that's really cool. So awesome. Yeah, so I've learned a lot, and I'm sure anyone listening hopefully is come away with a lot of things and ways to improve. Once again, just like Joseph said, actually listening, taking the time and truly listening, practice, practice, practice. Um, and so, Joseph, how can listeners connect with you and learn more about Clearsight Communications, which is your business? And I know you also have a book as well. So, like, tell us how to connect with you.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, the place I'm most active is on LinkedIn. So if you look for Joseph McGuire hyphen face facts, that's me. My website is clearsightcommunications.com, but I'm so far behind with that because I'm just primarily active on LinkedIn and networking. If you should happen to want a copy of the book, you can get it on Kindle, or if you want the hard copy, that is available through the website clearsightcommunications.com.
Awesome. Cool. And I'll put all of those links and stuff in the show notes or on the video description. So wherever you're watching or listening, you can get those easily. So thanks, Joseph, for being on the show. This has been awesome.
Oh, absolute pleasure, Justin. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And with that, we'll wrap the show.